But yeah, so basically today I'm talking to you about some work that I did at the University of Melbourne. So I was working on, again, some outcrop sediments with a focus on some very old rocks of the Precambrian that are outcropping in South Australia. So this is a time period that's very well known and famous as being a time period in which we have these so-called Snowball Earth glacial events. So it's a very interesting time to look at some outcrops. I was working at the University of Melbourne with Malcolm Wallish and Ashley Hood whilst I did some of this work. So just to get people situated, the Neoproterozoic is the youngest period of this Precambrian world. And this cryogenian time between 720 and 635 million years ago is the time period that I'm focusing on. And like I said, this is mostly well known for having these so-called Snowball Earth glacial events. This has mostly been revised to these slushable Earth glacials, but we're still pretty sure that we had some very large, very global, wide-reaching glacial events that happened for very long periods of time. So it's definitely a very interesting period to look at some outcrops. The other thing about the Precambrian Earth, which is very well known, is that we had some very strange carbonate rocks, as I'm sure those among you who are carbonate sedimentologists know far better than me. This was a time period where you had dolomite directly precipitating from oceans. The ocean water chemistry was completely different to anything during the Phanerozoic. And because of this, it's very hard to find analogues or comparisons for the Precambrian oceans when we're talking about carbonates in the Precambrian period. Sometimes people use comparisons as some of these very small, strangely geochemical lakes that you find. For example, there's one outside Melbourne. But overall, it just means that this time period can be very hard to find analogues for in this world. And this is where this lovely, slightly old now meme comes in. But the Precambrian is seen as very, very strange, crazy time when all of these things are happening that just aren't possible through most of the Earth's history that we all study from the Phanerozoic to the modern time period. So this, I think, has put off some people. That, and obviously the older the rocks are, the more difficult they can be to study because they've been highly tectonized and stuff. But this puts people off, I think, doing some more investigations into the clastic sedimentology in this time period. But there's certainly a lot of outcrops for people to look at. And although the carbonates can be very different and we can find it hard to find analogues for these, I would argue that the processes that are forming out of the clastic rocks are relatively similar. We didn't have particularly different gravity, and flows still moved in similar ways in which they did today. So to situate yourselves paleogeographically, this is from one of the younger parts of the Neoproterozoic. And this red box here is around South Australia. So South Australia was situated very close to the tropical regions. And so the large-scale glacial deposits we find in this area are obviously evidence that we had glaciers coming down quite close to tropical regions, which is where we have these Snowball Earth or slushable Earth hypothesis, where we have, let's say, glaciers down to low latitudes. As has been shown, everything wasn't always covered in glaciers, hence the slushable Earth hypothesis. This is a very scientific map of Australia to get you all situated into this lovely continent. And you can see here the lovely desert interior of Australia, and in particular, South Australia. So my location of study was just north of Adelaide in a place called the Flinders Ranges, just as you head into the beautiful Australian outback and desert. And it's a wonderful place to work. As we all know as well, deserts don't tend to have much vegetation and don't tend to have much large cities. And so it's a fantastic place to be able to look at some really fun, really great outcrops. So maybe a slightly more scientific map, but we are located here. Here is the coast and the city of Adelaide in South Australia. And here is just the border to Victoria and to New South Wales. So this is the Flinders Ranges here, just north of Adelaide. And the area that I've looked at is located in the northeast Flinders Ranges, near this very small settlement and sort of holiday village of Akarilla. So as you can see, like I said, fantastic desert environment. You have all of these anticlines and synclines, and you can follow the stratigraphy around all of these areas in the Flinders Ranges. So the South Australian Geological Survey have mapped the area at a wide scale, and there are fantastic maps available online where you can correlate all of these stratigraphic intervals around the Flinders Ranges, which, despite the lack of time constraints in this time period due to issues with dating and such, it means that we have very good stratigraphic references to go by at the very least. Now, on this bottom image here, you can just see in the square box my location of study. So it's overturned, well, it's going from older in this northern area to younger, and then back to older around the edge of the fold limb. And I've just here labeled two words here, the Sturtian and the Maranoan. So a Sturtian was this very large Snowball Earth glacial event. It goes by different names, and this is being revised, but I'll go with this name for now. And the Maranoan was a later, slightly smaller glacial event, smaller as in much shorter duration, but still with glacial deposits found in these tropical regions. And our outcrop is located basically in between these two glacial events. So this is a similar map on the right here, just showing these intervals. So my location is this one here, but just on the left-hand side, I have an overall stratigraphic column of the northern Flinders Ranges. And as I said, there's these really thick Sturtian glacials, so lots of diamict and glacial marine deposits. We then have these carbonates and sort of slope mudstones. We then have this smaller Maranoan glacial. So the two age dates we have in between these give us tens of millions of years to work with in terms of time intervals. So we don't have particularly great age constraints, as you can probably tell. But what you can see on the right-hand side here is sort of the location that I'm working at. And just up dip of this, we have this pale yellow color, and this is the Balcanoona reef complex. So this was a platform reef that has been worked on by people including Ashley Hood. And so this has been looked at a bit more detail and is located quite close to this small village of Akarilla. But actually down dip of this, a sort of oblique dip of this, we have, like I said, all these slope deposits, these slope mudstones and marls. And we also have what was recognized as a very large erosional surface cutting out some of these areas, about 10 kilometers down dip of that. So underneath here in the green is just this Sturtian glacial deposits, and this very thin brown one is the start of this Maranoan glacial. So we're directly in this interglacial time between these large Snowball Earth glacial events. This is a schematic section of this reef. So the reef has been mapped through various different fascies from the peritidal right into the reef margin. And this is, like I said, overlying this Sturtian glacial. And then overlying this, we have this sort of unconformity surface, and we have these calcareous mudstones. And these also have some laterally continuous limestone beds within them, which are these three darker green colored units. And these can be mapped through the region, and they're basically just known as like limestone 1, 2, and 3. But cutting through two of these, we have a very large erosional surface that had been noted in the stratigraphy. but only mentioned in passing in a paper written I think it was first written in 2009. So it's been a while. And so I basically went back to this outcrop to see what was happening there. So I don't know, about 2.5, 3 hours drive from Akarula. It doesn't look very far, but there are basically no roads apart from some very difficult 4-wheel drive tracks. You find yourself in this area here. And there was one regional log done in the area quite close by back in, I think, the early 2000s, which was sampled for carbon isotopes. But generally, you can see that there is about 1.5 kilometers of 1,500 meters of stratigraphy here, mostly carbonate muds. This is a sort of a breccia deposit. There's some sand beds through it, but it's mostly very similar to what we see in a lot of slope areas, which is just this mudstone with some sand beds in it. And this goes through these two different formations here. And the boundary of the formation is marked by a slight change in facies, and with these more sand-dominated units coming in, as well as these two regional limestone marker beds that I mentioned before. And you can see on the side here the carbon isotopes. We have this negative excursion at the base, just on top of the glacial deposits. We then have a general increase and then a sort of decrease through time throughout this time period. But there are some intricacies and changes, and it's not the same in every location for this same time period. But yeah, so basically the outcrop, like I said, we're about 10 kilometers down dip of this oblique dip of this unit, and of the Balcanoona reef complex. And this is a summary of my log section, which is about 600 meters thick. So if we're to zoom into that, on the left, you'll see some stitched drone imagery of this section, and the white lines just show various beds and intervals that were mapped out and marked through the section. The black line going straight through the middle is my log section that I took through, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But this is just to show that you generally, outside of what we're interpreting as the major surface, which is this one in blue on the right, you have some more laterally continuous beds, although you do still have a lot of slumping and remobilization of beds, which is pretty common for slope margins, as things tend to be moving down slope somewhat. But this is mostly made of, like I said, fine-grained carbonate muds, and also some sand beds and remobilized sands and carbonate beds through this. What we do have as a marker is there is a thick bed in here. Like I said, we're pretty sure that this is the L2 limestone that goes through. So this can be correlated through the section. So that gives us some stratigraphic constraint of our outcrop. And as you can see in my interpretation, well, my sort of outline interpretation on the right here, we basically have this one major confining surface that can be interpreted around, and it's about 600 meters deep and about 400 or 500 meters across. Obviously, that will change with compaction. So we can't be completely sure of the original dimensions, but it gives us some idea of the size. At the base, we have these remobilized intervals, less continuous beds. And then we move into the main body of this, what we're interpreting as a canyon itself, which has various different surfaces within it. And it changes it's quite different at the base, where you have several of these basal erosional surfaces outlined as the blue dashed lines, and you have sedimentary faults, which are the red dashed lines here. This then changes as you go up through the top to more laterally continuous beds. And I'll just tell you about the facies before I go into a bit more detail about this architecture afterwards. So in terms of the log section, like I said, it's about 600 meters thick. And we basically start at the base with carbonate muds, with a few intervening sand beds, but then also a lot of remobilized sand as well. So beds that look laterally continuous, but as you follow them out over meters or tens of meters, you find that they're part of very large folded and slumped intervals. We also have something very interesting, which is a block of what we think is the updip reef. So Ashley Hood, who worked on the reef, kind of is very familiar with it, and she was quite happy that we probably have quite a large block of reef, and I'll show you a picture of that later. As we go up through, we have a lot of layers of breccia, mostly coinciding with these large scale confining surfaces. And then we basically alternate between these remobilized units, some more laterally continuous beds, and more remobilized units. These paler colors are basically, there's more carbonate, and the darker browns is where there's sort of less carbonate. And we do have different stratigraphic horizons within this, suggesting the material that's being failed into the canyon is varying a little bit. So the source material is varying a little bit, but it's quite cyclical and it's quite similar. And that is until we get to this horizon here, where we have a major change into these really thick, sort of fine-grained sand beds, and with some silt as well. But we have mostly very slumped horizons and lots of dewatering structures and lots of amalgamation. And then as we move upwards, this becomes less, and we get better, more laterally continuous, sort of more defined bedding and more structured sand beds with ripple laminations and horizontal laminations. So we see quite a big change as we get into this top area here, which is where the sand starts basically. And so I divided it into these several units, but basically this is where we see the major change is right on the top here. And this is also coinciding where we see this L2 unit, which, as I said earlier, is also coinciding with the big formation changes between these two formations. And here is some actual pictures of rock. So at the very base of the canyon, before we get into these major surfaces, we do have this very large block of what we've interpreted as reef, and it's several meters thick and up to sort of 5 or 6 meters long. So it's quite a large block that's come down, and you can find some smaller runs around the place, but there's just me next to the block, and that's at the very base. As we then move upwards, you start to see a lot of this breccia, and as you'd expect, it's occurring around the basal margin and at the lateral margins, and coming into the lateral flanks of this feature, made up of different material, brecciated in different ways, but either way, you get a lot of this all around this confining surface. At the base, we have a lot of this sort of bedded and sometimes remobilized carbonate beds, which have these sort of like, you can see the laminations through it there, but that's quite a typical bed. And as we get more towards the top, you get these more sand-rich beds. And in this one in G here, you can see within it some of these soft sediment deformation structures that we get in some of these beds. D here is one of these, is a siltier bed with banding within it. And then in E here, you can see some of the horizontal and ripple laminations that we get within the top of the unit here. And in F, you can see a little bit of the faulting, sedimentary faulting that we have in some of these beds. So I took some samples through these beds for XRD analysis. Unfortunately, I didn't take that many samples as we were very far away from anything, and I didn't get to go back to take more samples in the end. But just to show basically that the information from the XRD did confirm this observations at outcrop, which is basically that we have this real lower unit that's really dominated by more carbonate material. So 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is very carbonate rich in these sort of silica rich carbonate mudstones. And then above that, we sampled obviously some of the silty layers in around the sand beds. But we basically end up in this mixed siliceous mudstone, apart from 2, where we sampled one of these sand beds in the lower unit, and it seems to be quite similar to the sand above. So we don't really have a major change in the types of clastic material that we're getting. It's just it becomes much more clastic dominated later in the section. And this is just a couple of thin section images to show you the same thing. So you can see this one here is from 199 meters. That's quite close to the base. And you can see that it's been dyed to show the calcite in the slide. And you can see how carbonate rich these sediments are, this sort of coarse silt material, medium to coarse silt material. And here for the upper one, you can see it's a lot more plastic rich, and you can see less of the calcite. You do start to get a little bit more dolomite as you come up section as well. Now, just to talk a little more about the architecture. So I showed you this image before showing this sort of the large scale architecture, and I'm just going to talk about how this changes from the base to the top. So like I said, we had this reef clast at the very base, and then we do have some sort of erosional based features cutting out the material below. So this is in this lower image just here. But it doesn't really have, there's not a layer of breccia along this surface. And the material infilling it is a lot of folded and slumped material with a bit of breccia within that. But my initial interpretation of these is that these might be some sort of landslide, or basically the deposits from some sort of remobilization up dip. And you see some of these features around across the margin, not just underneath the canyon, but I haven't looked at them in great detail. But basically my thought is that this is some sort of, we have this reef block falling down. We then start to have these lenticular shaped erosional features infilled with folded and slumped material. Now we do have two stacked on top of each other here, but they don't seem to be eroding that much on top of each other. So potentially they're more in like an open slope margin. So there's a bit more space for these things to move around, which is in quite significant contrast as you move up. And as you'd maybe expect, as we found this large scale confining surface, we then moved into these erosional based stacked lenticular features, which are really amalgamating into each other and eroding into each other one by one by one after each other. And these are also then filled with similar material, like I showed you in the log, lots of remobilized sand beds. Some you can follow out and be more laterally continuous, so sand beds and carbonate beds. And some are in these very large scale folds, you know, so 100 meters long, tens of meters thick. So very large scale folding, and some sedimentary faulting at the flanks of the canyon as well. Then as you move up through the unit, up through the outcrop, you basically come to what I said here is quite an interesting section. You start to get slightly more laterally continuous beds, less erosional features cutting into each other. And then this is capped by this bed here, which is a thick limestone bed. So like I said, this is what we're pretty sure is this regional L2 limestone bed. And you can actually follow it from the margin of the canyon, and you can follow chunks of it into the lateral sides of the canyon with thin sedimentary faults, and then it gets much thinner as you come into the center of the canyon, suggesting some of it's been either falling in for the flanks or was deposited inside and was remobilized at some point down dip through the canyon. But this is very interesting because this is, like I said, a key stratigraphic horizon in the area. And this shows that as this limestone bed was being deposited, there wasn't a big hole here. There wasn't 300-meter thick hole for this stuff to fall in, because we're not finding this limestone bed at the base of the canyon. So clearly this whole feature was cutting and filling, cutting and filling, cutting and filling throughout the process of formation. So it wasn't a massive open conduit, which was 600 meters deep. At any one time, it was maybe more in the hundreds of meters to tens of meters deep. again, depending on decompacting thickness and such things. But you can definitely see that these concave into the feature. Now, again, what is later structural issues and what is primary from the sedimentation. But this does seem to just occur in the center of the canyon here. Yeah, and then above this limestone unit, we have this dramatic change into the clastic dominated sedimentation. So we have these sort of dewatered, remobilized lump sandstones, and then into our lovely bedded sandstones above it there, where we have this distinct change. So basically, just to summarize that in this image, you can basically separate this into several different units. So our first unit here is maybe we have some of these basal sort of slope failures or landslides, which are cutting and eroding into the seafloor, into the slope floor, but then immediately depositing the material that was involved in that collapse on top of it, with these large scale fold structures in them as well. And below that, we just have a part of this reef crust. So we know we have some sort of shelf material and some slope material coming down and cutting and filling that in there. Then above that, we have lots of brecciated layers, plastering erosional surfaces. And when we have these composite erosional features cutting into each other over and over again. So these sort of cut and fill, cut and fill, cut and fill, with presumably a lot of material being cut and moved down slope. So again, whether we're still in a sort of, at this point, whether it would still be a slide scar with material moving through it, or whether it is a full conduit that we could call a sort of canyon is somewhat debatable, as we don't have the context around it. But we then move up into this unit where we start to get more laterally continuous beds. So things start to be less erosive, less bypass. So maybe a less active canyon or a conduit system here. And then this is topped by this regional limestone bed, which gives us a good marker of knowing at this point, this thing was only 100 meters deep, maybe 200 meters at maximum here, or something in that sort of scale. And then we have the falling of this bed into the flanks of the canyon, and some of it being bypassed down dip. So we still have some movement of things coming through the canyon there. We then come into this big, thick, dewatered and slightly remobilized sandstone unit, and then into our bedded sandstone. And so these are probably from some sort of turbidity currents being deposited. So when turbidity currents are deposited very rapidly, they can have large-scale dewatering, and that could be some of the big slumping and things we're seeing. Obviously, if things are being deposited on a very uneven surface, and especially we know we've got quite an uneven surface here, things can be remobilized into the center, down dip, around. But the really lovely bedded stuff above shows that we are somewhat healing some of this topography. And we have maybe less of a slope gradient, maybe less topography that we're infilling here. And this can sometimes be related also to abandonment and backfilling of canyons. So it's less of a conduit and it's more of a space for deposition at this point. But we don't, again, I don't have a down dip area to really constrain that. But if we were to put this into a model, it would basically then start to look something like this. So this is just a sort of schematic showing this up dip reef and some information that we do have. So this red line on the right diagram on the 3D model is supposed to express this schematic cross section I have on the left-hand side here. So something that we do have from the wider context of this area, so we know that there's a karst surface that's formed at the top of this reef. And there is this interpreted sea level fall that's causing the karstification of this top surface and the remobilization. And I did mention at the very beginning that there's interpreted to be a sort of maybe a hiatus or something happening around here. We're not really sure, but there is an unconformity surface overlying this reef. So we have karstification and remobilization of blocks coming down the slope. Now at our outcrop, we have some evidence of that. We do have a reef block right underneath our surface. We then have a period of potential just submarine landslides down the slope. And like I said, this cutting and filling and cutting and filling. And at the end of that, we're maybe into some sort of full conduit. There may be an intervening stage where we become just more of a landslide surface before it is a full conduit. And I'll discuss that in another model in just a moment. But then we're up to the point where we know that we have this L2 limestone draping across the area and either falling in from the flanks or being deposited in there and then being remobilized down dip. And this L1 that we don't have coming through the area, but the L2 gives us a good constraint on this. At this point, I don't know if the sea level is continuing to fall or if it stopped falling. We don't really have many constraints on that, but it could be that a continued sea level fall would obviously continuously erode and remove material down the slope, causing this cutting and filling that we're seeing. Again, we're talking over tens of billions of years, so the time period in which this is occurring, we're not completely sure. Another idea, which I will discuss in a moment after this, is that why do we have a canyon here and not in laterally adjacent areas? Something that we do know that we have in reef systems is that they can form in these sort of ribbon reefs. So we have areas of topographic highs where these reefs form, and there can be topographical lows in between these reef segments. And sediment can sometimes get filtered and moved in between these reef segments, which can cause the canyons to occur down dip of gaps in the reef. And that may particularly be more of the case for the clastic sedimentation that becomes afterwards. So maybe sedimentation on the shelf is being directed through a low in the reef, but again, we don't really have the direct up-dip comparison of that. But yes, then we get these units which are sort of infilling and draping and infilling the topography created by this low that we have. And then we sort of filling up to the top of the canyon here. We have like I said, these slump sand beds across the margin. You don't tend to get these bedded units that we have within the canyon across the margin. And this is a really dramatic change from carbonate dominated to clastic dominated system. So whether that's to do with a sudden change in the sea level, whether it's to do with something changing in the geochemistry of Neoproterozoic oceans that I don't really understand, or whether it's to do with just linking with a conduit up dip, so a river delta system coming in and then somehow coming into this area and causing this massive increase in carbonate and clastic sedimentation. That could also be something to consider. So just to quickly say that although, like I said, it's very hard to compare carbonate sediments with modern and the Neoproterozoic, we can use more modern or Phanerozoic systems to sort of help us get an idea of what some of these slope margins look like. So this is just an image from the modern day Great Barrier Reef, just offshore Queensland. The exact location is not important, but just to show this is at 4 times vertical scale exaggeration. But this is what these kind of margins look like. So you can see an area on the left here, which is less gullied and less channeled. So maybe we have some of that area as well, where you just have normal slope processes. But you can get these really intricate channels, canyons, and gully systems. So this is just a bathymetric image. So we're going from 10 meters depth into 2,500 meters in depth. But you can see that the canyons aren't just straight, they're going to move around and be parallel to the shore and perpendicular to the shore in places. But you have a lot of submarine landslides all across the region. And you're going to have a lot of remobilization from the flanks of these and from the headscarps and the walls of these gullies and canyons. But also just to point out that the reef here, obviously this is a different system in that these are forming at the same time as the reef system is still active. And we're considering that ours is slightly after the reef system was active. But we may still have topography on the shelf left from these sort of ribbon reefs, and that you do have areas in between the major reef sections that can basically focus the sediments to come in at particular locations and create larger canyons in these areas. So their model that they use in the Great Barrier Reef example, I think can be somewhat compared to our Neoproterozoic system. So you start with slope destabilization and slope failures, and we know we have some sort of sea level fall in our system and that we have these reef blocks coming down and starting to erode some of the slope material. It could be that we're starting to trigger some of these submarine landslides. And then as soon as you have the submarine landslide location, you can start to focus material and move through it through axial incision, but also they start to cut back through headward erosion. So material starts to collapse back up slope as this area is destabilized. And that might be something that's happening just at the base of our canyon to trigger the location of our canyon to be particularly there. You can then form these sort of incipient gullies and things like this. Now, around our outcrop location, there are some smaller features, but I haven't studied them in detail, so I can't say too much about these, but we may have some things like that. And then as the canyon matures, it can then really connect to the up-dip sediment influx systems, basically. And it may just be that this is what's happening when we have our sudden clastic input, and it's just overwhelming any carbonate production. But what I would say is we see this big change from carbonate to clastics across the whole slope, because that's one of the characteristic things from changing from one formation to the other. So I don't think this is just this may be why we're getting our thick bedded turbidites, is because we've connected to the shelf. But it can't explain the change of the carbonate dominated to clastic dominated across the whole margin. And like I said, we have a slightly different situation in that we're forming after the reef has stopped prograding and is starting to be eroded. But it's possible that we still have topography on the shelf from the various large, thick, tens of meter thick reefs, and that we are creating a conduit down dip of one of these gaps in the reef system. So that may also play an influence in this. And just very quickly to say that this isn't the only canyon systems that you find in the Flinders Ranges. So there are these other canyon systems called the Wanaka Canyons, and these are actually much more famous and they're better studied than the one I was just showing you, which hasn't really been studied in detail before. So as I said, our one that I was just showing you now is in between this large Sturtian glacial event and the smaller Maranoan glacial event in this sort of interglacial time. And the Wanaka Canyons are formed after the Maranoan glacial event. So similarly in this sort of interglacial time period. The Wanaka Canyons are actually up to kilometers deep. They're really huge. And they also are outcropping all around the central part of the Flinders Ranges and also in the northern part near where we were as well. And just to show you an image of one of these, you can see how huge they are. So this is a 500-meter scale bar. So this is kilometers across and a kilometers deep. So this is a whole different scale of canyon. And there is some debate about how these formed. It's a sort of, some people said that they were subaerially formed and then drowned and filled in with deep water sediment. But I think the more decided version of this is that they form potentially as in a similar way to how I just described, but these are much larger canyons and clearly much longer lived. And as they, like I said, they occur all over the central and northern Flinders Ranges. And we do have some similarities. Obviously, you have sort of the channelized sections, the slumped units, the brecciated margins. But these have, you know, like I said, these are much more developed, much more long-lived features than what we see in our other one. These are also have, I think, the biggest negative carbonate isotope excursion that's ever been measured is at the base of these canyons. So they're also happening at a very strange time. But they were also interpreted to have this basically cut and fill stage of erosion and bypass at the base, and then this backfilling with all of these more laterally continuous sediments at the top of the unit. So again, forming in a similar way. Yeah. So basically, just to wrap up everything that I talked about, we have this sort of 600-meter deep, sort of 400 or 500-meter wide canyon feature, and this is forming in one of the interglacial periods between two major Snowball Earth glacial events in this Neoproterozoic time. So it does follow sort of our known canyon forming models, so landslides creating erosional features at the base, and then back cutting, and then the brecciated surfaces cut and fill, bypass and erosion, and then the backfilling and infill of the canyon afterwards. So like I said, there's no reason that we can't use more modern Orphanomerozoic models to help us understand these Neoproterozoic times in these cases. We have this really big change from these carbonate to clastic dominated across the margin, and it's not really understood exactly why that's happening. Like I said, if it's just changes in the sediment input volumes, or if it's changes to do with deepening, or to do with changes in ocean chemistry and such, it's very hard to know why we're losing a lot of the carbonate. Like I said, it could relate to many of these different things. We can see very similar features in the modern day slope, such as in the Great Barrier Reef, that can help us understand and model what might be happening in these settings, because obviously we're so restricted in terms of the outcrop exposure that I just showed you. I can follow the margin laterally and down dip, but it's not like we can in some of these beautiful outcrops, like where I worked in the Karoo Basin in South Africa, where we could follow these big canyon systems through very closely spaced outcrops. Unfortunately, we can't do that here. It's not the only Snowball Earth interglacial canyons we see, and there are much bigger ones that happen later on after the Maranoan glacial. Obviously, outcrops are only a snapshot of what we're seeing. It's very hard to put them in context of what's happening in the real world. But I hope that this presentation has showed that we can investigate this a bit more, and that we don't just have to rely on the geochemical data that we have to understand the Neoproterozoic, and that we can try and understand them in a more stratigraphical and clastic sedimentology context as well. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. I'll be very interested to hear people's ideas or feedback from this.